right? If you find maybe 2 papers and you come back to Dr. Zink and you tell him, I found only 2 papers on this area, and there is no theoretical foundation for that, he's going to throw you out the window, not the door. Why? Because obviously there is, no, yeah, I know, you're not throwing anyone. Oh, I apologize. Good one. But the idea is that you got to understand the fundamental theories behind that, okay? And there might be fundamental theories that might guide the work that you can develop on and build your research and improve research in certain area. So we do use keywords to some extent. We understand that keywords are a starting point, but not the end point for literature search. Okay? So when you are in the phase of the input, of the absorption, of the collections of articles, this is not where you end. This is just one of 3 steps. And those of you who took my class, you're aware of the process. I'm going to run through it quickly, but the idea is we're doing what is called backwards and forward search. And let me run down quickly. The idea is that to take a paper that you found from the keywords search that makes sense to you, and not only read that, read the conclusions, read the research itself, and first of all, make a determination if it's a good quality paper or not, but also go and look at the references of that paper. And so you take that paper, and at this point you have 1 paper, and I'm going to put the counter on top of the number of papers. You have 1 paper, and here you have a set of references to that paper, because if you find a paper that has no references, then don't use it. Okay? Exactly. It's called a website. Actually, some websites do have references. They're improving, right? So the idea is to take that reference and go and pull the references. This is what we call 1 level down, okay? Backward. So you take a paper, you take the references of that paper, and you go through the references, and you say, what references make sense in my interested area of research? Well, guess what? Maybe some of these references are not directly related or not using those buzzwords. Or maybe as you go through that process, you're going to learn all their buzzwords. It's like the ERP systems used to be called MRP before, right? Or different terms before. And now they're switching into enterprise-wide systems. These terms are evolving, especially in the information systems field, very quickly. And this is another way for you to catch those phrases or those key terms that are over years evolved by looking at references and studies that were conducted. So we pulled back 1, and you took those 4 references out of a list of, let's say this paper had 20 or 30 references. You went back and you pulled these. And so you captured those. Hopefully you downloaded them, as I mentioned here, in PDF, and you were able to review them. And so at this point, you're going to do a 2nd level down. You're going to actually go further into the references of the references. So in this process, you can see how the numbers are increasing, obviously, right? So as you go through the process, into a 3rd level, right, you get already 85, assuming that you get 4 for each. In the process, you get to a point where you have about 85, or let's say between 50 to 100 articles, starting from a single article, going backwards. Okay? And so the idea is to actually go and read the papers, pull the references of the references, and that will create some kind of a web. And now, so this was a paper backwards. This is taking a paper and starting from the paper and going backwards from its references, all the references that were used in a single paper. The point here is to go and do a backward search on the author to see what that author has done before that paper. So what you can do is you can go to the database, and I'm just giving here an example in ProQuest. You can do the same thing in ScienceDirect, in the IEEE, in the ACM, in all the other databases, in the IGI database, in the Web of Science, all the other databases. You put the author name, and then you select it as an author, and you tell the database, give me all the articles going backwards before this date, and you put the date, and then make sure you check, very important in this database. In other databases, it's a little bit different. For example, in IEEE, there is a checkbox for journals only. In ACM, you can check for journals only, for peer-reviewed journals only. So you don't get conference proceedings, you don't get the magazines per se. Or if you want to get those strong foundational pure research that was conducted, this is a way for you to get to that area. And again, nothing is carved in stone. Obviously, in the conference proceedings, there are preliminary work done in certain areas. So if you're dealing with something that is very, very new in the area of security or certain areas of security, certain areas of computer science, certain areas of implementation, and you want to see the most recent stuff, you probably want to search for those conference proceedings. But again, you got to evaluate the quality as well. Make sure you choose the ones from organizations, recognized organizations, as we said. And so that's the idea of going backwards on an author, and you can do this to multiple authors as well. And the last approaches or techniques that I'm advocating here is obviously the forward search, which you can already realize what it is. It's essentially taking the same paper and going forward. What other papers use this paper as a reference? So you go to the database and you actually set it up and tell the database, this paper, give me all the papers that use this one as a reference. As a matter of fact, some good databases will already give it to you when you see the paper. If you go to ScienceDirect, for example, on the right side, there is an area where they will tell you, yesterday I looked at that article, it says on the side, there are 23 articles referenced to this one. So you click, you actually see the list of all the newer papers that use that paper as a reference. So this is moving forward, obviously. Okay, and that adds to our counter as we progress, and you get the point of going forward and going forward. And sometimes you get to the most recent, and that's what it is. And sometimes you get to the most recent, and you won't be able to achieve that or grab that paper because it's so new. It just published a month ago, and all you can see is the title and the abstract. And these things happen during the literature search. So you can see my numbers, of course, are hypothetical, so increasing it forward as well and combining it with the backward, you can understand that you're getting a lot of papers. You can get from starting with a good single article. And the idea of going forward on the author is the same thing, taking that year where the paper was published, asking to give you all the papers that were moved forward from that point on. Okay? So just to recap what we discussed in terms of the input process, the input stage, we talked about the keyword search. We talked about the reason why we need to start with keyword search, and we talked about the limitations with keywords. Then we talked about backwards and forward, and the idea is to start with an article and get to a network of articles, okay, and into that network. Now, you don't really need to wire it the way that it is demonstrated here, but you can see the point of how papers are connected. The problem is what happens, and this is the nodes in our brain, what happens is when we have too many of these points, you've got to have some kind of a system that will tell you what makes more sense than others. And this is, as you go through that process, what you will realize, and this takes time. This is why dissertations and other good quality research is not something you accomplish in one weekend, but it will take you time to realize, is that you got to create some kind of a systematic view in your head as you go through the literature, as you go through the literature search, as you go through the names of the authors, as you go through the titles of the papers, of creating some kind of a system in your head for these papers. And the system I have is, think about it, is the more a paper is being cited, referred to, the larger that paper becomes in your head. And papers that are just were referred to in one corner, they're not giants yet. They might be new, so they're not giants yet. They're not highly cited. But what you need to think about is these big ones that are foundational to a lot of studies. That's what you got to think in your head as you go through the process, as you read the names of the authors. This is what, when I say giants, I refer to certain authors in the literature that are essentially giants. If they, as a result of a single or multiple research that they've conducted, there is a stream of hundreds of research papers were conducted, right? This is what I'm referring to as the larger nodes in the network, okay? And again, this is an illustration from some kind of a brain research. So the idea is, obviously you can see this process expanding and expanding and expanding, and the first question I have is, how do you tell that you're done? How do you know that you're done with your literature search? And the answer is, obviously, you're never done, right? You got to put a stop somewhere and say, okay, enough. I got my hands through enough that I can build whatever I want to build on based on that foundation. There are multiple processes that were introduced in literature in terms of the whole sequence of going through the literature search. And I showed a couple of, illustrated here, a couple of approaches. The funnel approach, where you narrow your search on a certain area, or the narrowing and then expanding, narrowing and then expanding, depends on your area. And then the looking through a monocular to a certain phenomena. So you look at it only through the view of a single research stream. You're ignoring all other research streams, for example. That's another philosophy. So rule of thumb, when do you know that you're done? Okay, I've spent 3 months searching and looking for the top-ized journals, and in the top-ized journals I looked for articles, and in those articles I pulled them up, and I have this mess in my office, and how do I know that I'm getting there? I'm getting close to putting my hands around what we call body of knowledge. Well, these are what we came up as some kind of a rule of thumb. If you start getting familiar with the arguments, right? The process of the arguments sounds familiar, paper after paper after paper. If you see very familiar methodologies are being used to address a certain area. If you start seeing the same findings in different contexts, similar findings. If you don't find similar findings, also it's important if you find dual types of findings that are competing or contradicting, that's also good. Okay, but if you find a group of articles that will say this is similar findings in a certain context, and this is the most easy one to recognize, if you start finding familiar authors and familiar studies, these are coming back to my my drawing here, is as you start reading these other articles, you start seeing all of them reference to this single or these two giants or two major articles. So you start seeing the same authors, the same papers being cited as a foundation. You're probably there. You understand, you know these individuals already, and you already have all their research, all their process of research over the years. Caveat with the issue of how to deal with what we've done so far is management. And management of literature is a fundamental key. Because if you don't manage properly your literature as you go through the input process, you're going to be devastated through the process.